Agent Carter sat in the dimly lit briefing room, his fingers drumming nervously on the metal table. This was it, his first real mission as a member of the Mobile Task Force. The air was thick with tension as the squad leader, Captain Reynolds, strode into the room, his expression as grim as ever. "Listen up," Reynolds barked, slapping a file onto the table. "We've got an assignment. SCP-966, codename Sleep Killers. They're active in a small town about 50 miles from here. We've lost contact with 3 agents already, so this isn't going to be a walk in the park." Carter's heart pounded as Reynolds continued, outlining the characteristics of SCP-966. These creatures were nearly invisible to the naked eye, detectable only through infrared goggles. They inflicted sleep deprivation and hallucinations on their victims, weakening them until they were easy prey. The captain's voice was steady, but the flicker of concern in his eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. "We roll out in 10, Reynolds concluded. "Gear up and stay sharp. These things are cunning, and they won't hesitate to tear you apart." Carter rose from his seat, the knot in his stomach tightening as he donned his gear. His teammates, all seasoned operatives, moved with a practiced ease that only made him feel more like a rookie. Agent Ruiz, a veteran with countless missions under his belt, gave Carter a reassuring nod as he handed him a pair of infrared goggles. "Don't worry, kid," Ruiz said, his voice a low rumble. "Just stick to the plan, and you'll be fine." But Carter wasn't so sure. As they boarded the transport vehicle, the unease grew. This wasn't a training exercise, it was the real deal. The town they were headed to had been experiencing a string of mysterious deaths, victims found emaciated and sleep-deprived, with no sign of struggle. The local authorities were clueless, and it was up to them to contain the anomaly before it spread. The drive was silent, the only sound being the low hum of the vehicle's engine. The town came into view, shrouded in a blanket of fog that seemed almost too perfect, like something out of a nightmare. The streets were eerily deserted, the windows of the houses dark and lifeless. As the vehicle came to a stop, Carter took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The team moved quickly, setting up their base of operations in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was a dilapidated structure, creaking with every gust of wind. Inside, they established a command center, monitoring equipment, and weaponry specifically designed for this mission. Carter watched as Captain Reynolds and Agent Ruiz discussed tactics, feeling the weight of the infrared goggles around his neck. "All right," Reynolds said, addressing the team. "We've got reports of sightings around the north sector. We're splitting into 2-man units to cover more ground. Ruiz, take Carter and scout the eastern perimeter. Keep your eyes open and your goggles on. These things could be anywhere." Carter nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat as he followed Ruiz out into the night. The town was deathly silent, the only sound being the crunch of gravel under their boots. The fog swirled around them, thickening the atmosphere with a sense of impending doom. Carter adjusted his goggles, scanning the area for any sign of movement. "Remember," Ruiz whispered, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "They feed on fear. Stay calm, and they won't have the upper hand." Carter nodded again, his grip tightening on his rifle. They moved cautiously through the streets, checking each alleyway and shadowed corner. Hours seemed to pass in a blur of tension, every creak and rustle setting Carter's nerves on edge. It was as if the town itself was alive, watching them with unseen eyes. Then, just as Carter began to think they were on a wild goose chase, he caught a glimpse of something through his goggles. A faint, humanoid shape, barely visible against the backdrop of the fog. His heart skipped a beat as he nudged Ruiz, pointing towards the figure. "Got something," he whispered. Ruiz turned, his gaze locking onto the shape. He nodded, signaling Carter to move forward. They advanced slowly, keeping their rifles trained on the target. The figure seemed to flicker in and out of focus, a spectral presence that sent a chill down Carter's spine. Suddenly, the shape darted forward with a speed that made Carter's blood run cold. It moved in a blur, a ripple in the fabric of reality. Ruiz fired a burst of rounds, the gunfire echoing through the silent streets, but the creature was too fast. It vanished into the fog, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. "Stay sharp," Ruiz hissed, his eyes scanning the darkness. "It's toying with us." Carter's pulse quickened as he scanned the area, every nerve in his body screaming to run, to get out of this godforsaken place. But he stood his ground, gripping his weapon tighter. This was what he had trained for, and he wasn't about to let fear get the better of him. Then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, coming from somewhere nearby. Carter's breath caught in his throat as he turned towards the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. They rushed towards the source, their boots pounding against the pavement. They found the victim in an alley, a man in his 30s, thrashing and clawing at his own skin. His eyes were wide with terror, his body emaciated and covered in deep scratches. He was muttering incoherently, his voice a hoarse whisper as he fought against an unseen enemy. "Please, make it stop. I can't sleep. I can't." Ruiz moved to restrain the man, but as soon as he touched him, the man let out a spine-chilling shriek and collapsed, his body going limp. Ruiz checked for a pulse, but it was too late. The man was dead, his face frozen in an expression of sheer horror. Carter felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he looked at the lifeless body. This was the work of SCP-966, a creature that thrived on fear and desperation, and they were right in the middle of its hunting grounds. "We need to fall back," Ruiz said, his voice strained. "This thing is playing with us. We need to regroup and come up with a new strategy." Carter nodded, his mind racing as they made their way back to base. This was only the beginning, and he knew it was going to get a lot worse before it got better. The sleep killers were out there, watching, waiting for their next move. And Carter could only hope they'd be ready when the time came. The air was thick with dread as Agent Carter and Ruiz made their way back to the makeshift base. Each step was haunted by the echoes of that horrified scream, and Carter couldn't shake the image of the man's twisted, tormented face. The fog seemed to press in around them, whispering promises of unseen horrors lurking just beyond their vision. When they arrived at the base, Captain Reynolds was already there, his expression grim as he listened to their report. The room was dimly lit, shadows dancing across the walls like restless spirits. The other members of the team looked up as Carter spoke, their faces hardening at the mention of SCP-966's handiwork. "We're dealing with a pack," Reynolds said finally, his voice low and steady. "They're playing with us, using the fog to their advantage. We need to draw them out. Force them into the open where we can get a clear shot." "That's easier said than done," Ruiz muttered. "These things are clever, and they've got the whole town to hide in." "We don't have a choice," Reynolds snapped. "If we don't act, more people will die. We need to flush them out, make them come to us." The team quickly formulated a plan. They would set up motion sensors and traps around the town's perimeter, forcing SCP-966 into a confined area. Then, they would use high-powered lights and infrared equipment to track and neutralize them. It was a risky strategy, but it was their best shot at containing the creatures. As the team moved out to set up the equipment, Carter felt the weight of the mission bearing down on him. The streets were eerily silent, the buildings looming like dark sentinels against the foggy sky. He could feel SCP-966 watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They worked quickly, planting sensors in alleyways and doorways, rigging traps to be triggered by the slightest movement. Carter's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the settings on a motion detector, the cold metal biting into his fingers. Every sound, every flicker of movement sent a jolt of fear through him, but he forced himself to focus. This was his job now, and he had to see it through. As they finished setting up the last of the equipment, a sudden noise caught Carter's attention. A faint scraping sound, like claws on concrete. He froze, scanning the area through his infrared goggles. At first he saw nothing, just the swirling haze of the fog. Then, a shape emerged from the darkness. It was barely visible, a ghostly outline against the backdrop of the alleyway. Carter's heart skipped a beat as he raised his rifle, his finger poised on the trigger. The shape moved slowly, almost lazily, as if it knew he was watching. "Got one," Carter whispered into his radio, his voice barely audible. "East alleyway, 30 meters out." "Hold your position," Reynolds' voice crackled in his ear. "Wait for it to get closer." Carter swallowed hard, keeping his rifle trained on the figure. It was inching forward, its movements deliberate and unsettling. He could see the outline of its long, bony limbs, the way it seemed to shimmer and distort in the dim light. It was like looking at a nightmare made flesh. Suddenly, the creature stopped. It turned its head toward Carter, and for a brief moment he felt like it was looking directly into his eyes. His breath caught in his throat, his finger twitching on the trigger. He wanted to fire, to blast that thing back into whatever hell it came from. But then it was gone, vanishing into the fog like a wisp of smoke. Carter blinked, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. Had it been real, or was it just another one of SCP-966's tricks? "Stay sharp," Reynolds ordered. "It's testing us, trying to lure us out. Don't take the bait." Carter nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. The waiting was the worst part, the feeling of being hunted by something that thrived on fear and darkness. He forced himself to breathe, to focus on the task at hand. Minutes stretched into hours as they patrolled the town, the sensors blinking in the gloom. Every so often, a distant scream would echo through the fog, sending a shiver down Carter's spine. They were losing time, and the creatures knew it. Then, without warning, all hell broke loose. The sensors went off in rapid succession, a cacophony of beeps and alarms that shattered the silence. Carter's heart leaped into his throat as he spun around, his goggles lighting up with the frenzied movement of SCP-966. "They're all around us," Ruiz shouted, his rifle firing into the darkness. "Move, move, move." Carter followed suit, firing at the ghostly figures that darted through the fog. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire and the shrill wails of the creatures as they closed in from all sides. They were faster than Carter had anticipated, their movements a blur of shadow and light. One of the creatures lunged at Carter, its claws raking through the air inches from his face. He ducked and fired, the bullets ripping through the creature's ethereal form. It let out a spine-chilling shriek and dissolved into the mist, but Carter knew it wasn't over. "Fall back to the base," Reynolds ordered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "We can't take them here." Carter and Ruiz sprinted back toward the base, the creatures in hot pursuit. Carter could feel the cold breath of SCP-966 on the back of his neck, the sense of something ancient and malevolent closing in on him. He fired blindly behind him, his mind a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. They burst through the door of the base, slamming it shut behind them. The team regrouped, their faces pale and drawn. Outside, the creatures howled and scratched at the walls, trying to find a way in. "We need to draw them inside," Reynolds said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "We can't fight them out there in the open. We lure them into the traps, then hit them with everything we've got." Carter nodded, his heart still racing. This was it, their last stand against the sleep killers. He readied his weapon, his mind steeling itself for the battle to come. The creatures were out there, hungry and relentless, but they would fight back. They had to. Inside the dimly lit base, the air was thick with tension. The walls seemed to close in as the MTF operatives prepared for the oncoming assault. Outside, the sounds of SCP 966 scratched and clawed at the edges of their sanity, a symphony of scraping nails and guttural whispers that seeped through the cracks in the old building. Agent Carter stood at the ready, his infrared goggles strapped to his head and his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. The room was cast in an eerie red hue from the emergency lighting, casting long shadows that danced like specters around them. His pulse pounded in his ears, each beat a reminder of how close they were to the brink of disaster. "Remember the plan," Captain Reynolds barked, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "We draw them inside and force them into the traps. No heroics. Stick together. Watch each other's backs." Carter nodded, his throat dry. He glanced at Agent Ruiz, who gave him a grim nod. The veteran's usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a hardened focus that spoke of countless encounters with the unknown. This was different, though. Skip 96 wasn't just another anomaly. It was something primal, something that fed on the very essence of human fear. A loud crash echoed from the front of the building, followed by a guttural screech that sent a chill down Carter's spine. The creatures were testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses. The sounds of clawing grew louder, more frantic, as if the sleep killers were taunting them, daring them to make a move. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a gust of cold air swept through the room. Carter's finger hovered over the trigger, his eyes fixed on the doorway. For a heartbeat, everything was still, the world holding its breath in anticipation. Then, they came. Skip 966 stormed into the room, their forms barely visible, even through the infrared goggles. Carter could make out their elongated limbs, the distorted outlines of their gaunt bodies as they moved with inhuman speed. They were like living shadows, flickering in and out of existence, their presence sending waves of terror crashing over him. "Light them up," Reynolds shouted, and the room erupted into chaos. The operatives opened fire, their rifles blazing as they unleashed a torrent of bullets into the approaching horrors. Carter squeezed the trigger, the recoil jolting through his arms as he aimed at the fleeting shapes. The creatures howled in response, their cries a blend of anger and agony that cut through the air like a knife. The traps activated, blinding flashes of light and high-frequency sound waves filling the space. Speed 966 recoiled, their forms writhing as they tried to retreat from the onslaught. For a moment, it seemed like they had the upper hand, that they could actually drive these things back into the shadows. But the creatures adapted quickly. They surged forward again, their movements more frenzied and erratic. One of them lunged at an operative, its claws raking across his chest with a sickening crunch. The man screamed, collapsing to the floor in a spray of blood. Carter's heart skipped a beat as he turned his rifle toward the creature, firing a burst of rounds that tore through its body. It shrieked and dissolved into the fog, but Carter knew it wasn't dead. None of them were. They were playing with their prey, wearing them down bit by bit. "Fall back," Reynolds ordered, his voice strained. "Regroup at the rear entrance." Carter moved with the others, his eyes darting around the room as the creatures closed in. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Every shadow seemed to twist and shift, hiding something just out of sight. He could hear the soft padding of feet, the raspy breaths of Skep 966, as they circled, like wolves around a wounded animal. They reached the rear entrance, barricading themselves behind overturned tables and crates. Carter's breath came in ragged gasps as he reloaded his rifle, his fingers trembling. This was a nightmare, a relentless assault that showed no sign of stopping. Suddenly, one of the creatures materialized in front of them, its skeletal face inches from Carter's own. He could see the hollow pits where its eyes should have been, the way its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. He froze, terror paralyzing his limbs. "Move, Carter," Ruiz shouted, shoving him aside as he fired point blank into the creature's face. The creature recoiled, its form distorting as it let out a scream that shook the walls. Carter stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. He had been so close to death, to being torn apart by this thing that defied all logic and reason. "Get it together, rookie," Ruiz growled, his eyes never leaving the swirling fog. "They're not invincible. We can kill them, but you have to keep your head in the game." Carter nodded, swallowing hard. The creatures were regrouping, their movements more calculated now. They were learning, adapting to the MTF's tactics. They had to come up with something new, something that would tip the scales in their favor. "Ruiz, get those grenades ready," Reynolds commanded. "We need to blast these things into oblivion." Ruiz nodded, pulling out a set of flashbang grenades. They wouldn't kill SCP 966, but they might disorient them long enough for the team to make a move. Carter took one, his fingers curling around the cold metal. This was it, their last chance to turn the tide. The creatures advanced again, their movements a blur of darkness and teeth. Carter's pulse quickened as he pulled the pin on the grenade, his eyes locked on the closest figure. He hurled it into the midst of them, the flashbang exploding in a blinding light that sent the creature screeching in pain. "Now," Reynolds shouted, and the team opened fire. Bullets ripped through the air, striking the disoriented figures. SCP-966 thrashed and wailed, their forms flickering in the harsh light. Carter felt a surge of adrenaline as he emptied his clip, each shot driving the creatures back, inch by inch. But then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The creatures retreated, dissolving into the fog, as if they had never been there. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the operatives. Carter lowered his rifle, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. They had survived, but at a cost. 2 operatives lay motionless on the floor, their lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. The others were bloodied and bruised, their faces pale and drawn. "This isn't over," Reynolds said, his voice cold and steady. "We may have driven them back, but they'll be back. We need to regroup and come up with a new strategy. These things are smarter than we thought." Carter nodded, his mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. They had faced SCP-966 and lived to tell the tale. But he knew this was just the beginning. The sleep killers were out there, watching and waiting for their next move. And he could only hope they'd be ready when the time came. The base was a husk of what it once was, littered with shattered equipment and the lingering scent of gunpowder. The dim emergency lights flickered, casting uneasy shadows that seemed to dance with sinister intent. The team gathered around Captain Reynolds, their faces a mix of exhaustion and grim determination. They were bruised, bleeding, but not broken. "We can't let them regroup," Reynolds stated, his voice a low growl. "We push back now, or they will finish us off before dawn." Carter swallowed, the cold weight of his rifle a comfort against his gloved hands. The last encounter had left them rattled, the sheer ferocity and cunning of SCP-966, far beyond what they had anticipated. These weren't just creatures, they were predators, playing a deadly game with the team as their prey. "Here's the plan," Reynolds continued, spreading a map of the town across the table. "They've been using the fog to mask their movements. We need to draw them out into the open, force them into a bottleneck where we can hit them with everything we've got." "We're going to need bait," Ruiz muttered, his gaze locked on the map, something to lure them in. Carter's heart skipped a beat. He knew what Ruiz was implying, and the thought made his blood run cold. He looked at the others, seeing the silent, grim acceptance on their faces. Someone had to take the risk, to put themselves out there as a target. "I'll do it," Carter said, the words leaving his mouth before he could second-guess himself. The others turned to him, surprise flickering in their eyes. "Are you sure about this, Rookie?" Reynolds asked, his tone serious. "This isn't just about bravery. It's about survival." "I'm sure," Carter replied, his voice steady. "We need to end this. And if this is what it takes, then I'm in." Reynolds nodded, a glint of respect in his eyes. "All right then. Ruiz, you cover Carter. The rest of us will set up an ambush point. Remember, we have one shot at this. Make it count." Carter felt a strange sense of calm settle over him as they moved out. The fog still clung to the town, a murky blanket that hid the horrors lurking within. The town was a ghostly labyrinth of silent streets and darkened windows, each corner potentially hiding death. Every step was a journey into the unknown, and Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They reached the designated spot, an intersection surrounded by dilapidated buildings. The team set up their positions quickly, placing flashbangs and high-powered lights in strategic locations. Carter took his place in the center of the street, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on him. He adjusted his goggles, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. "Stay sharp," Ruiz whispered, his eyes scanning the rooftops. "They're out there, waiting." Minutes stretched into eternity as they waited in the eerie silence. Carter's heart pounded in his chest, his senses heightened to the point of pain. Every creak, every rustle of wind was a potential threat. He could feel SCP-966, their presence like a cold hand on the back of his neck. Then, there it was, a faint shimmer in the fog. Carter tensed, his finger on the trigger as he strained to make out the shape. It was a flicker at first, barely there, but then it solidified into the outline of one of the creatures. Its long limbs and hollow eyes were barely visible through the haze, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through him. "Contact," Carter whispered into his radio, keeping his voice low. 1 o'clock, 20 meters out. "Hold your fire," Reynolds commanded. "Wait for my signal." The creature moved closer, its movement slow and deliberate, like a spider stalking its prey. Carter could feel the icy tendrils of fear creeping up his spine, but he forced himself to stay still. This was the plan. He was the bait, and he had to trust his team. More shapes appeared in the fog, circling around him with an almost predatory grace. Carter counted at least 3, but there could be more. They moved silently, their forms barely disturbing the air around them. He could hear his own breathing, harsh and ragged in the confines of his mask. "Steady," Ruiz whispered, his rifle trained on the nearest creature. "Wait for it." The lead creature paused, its head tilting as if it were listening to some silent command. Carter's heart skipped a beat. Did it know? Could it sense the trap they had laid? He held his breath, every muscle in his body coiled and ready to spring. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, the creatures lunged. "Now," Reynolds shouted. The street exploded into chaos. Flashbangs detonated, flooding the area with blinding light and deafening noise. Carter fired his rifle, the bullets tearing into the creatures as they shrieked and writhed in the glare. He moved with practiced precision, his training taking over as he aimed and fired. Speed 966 thrashed in the light, their forms twisting and distorting as they tried to escape. The air was filled with their screeches, a sound that drilled into Carter's mind and threatened to rip his sanity apart. He gritted his teeth, focusing on the task at hand. They had to be destroyed. All of them. "Keep firing," Reynolds ordered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Don't let them regroup." Carter reloaded, his hands moving with mechanical efficiency. He aimed at the nearest creature, its hollow eyes staring at him with a malevolent hunger. He fired, the bullet tearing through its chest in a spray of dark ichor. It staggered, letting out a final, ear-piercing wail before collapsing into a writhing heap. But they weren't done yet. The remaining creatures circled around, their movements more frantic and desperate. They were being driven into a corner, and like any cornered predator, they were becoming more dangerous. One of them lunged at Carter, its claws outstretched. He ducked, feeling the air whoosh past as the creature sailed over him. He spun around, firing into its back as it landed on the ground. It screeched, thrashing wildly as it tried to rise. "Cover me," Carter shouted, moving forward to finish it off. Ruiz opened fire, laying down a barrage of bullets that forced the other creatures back. Carter approached the wounded Skip 966, his rifle trained on its head. It looked up at him, its eyes full of a dark, malevolent intelligence. He hesitated, just for a second, the sheer alienness of the thing causing a flicker of doubt in his mind. Then he squeezed the trigger, the gunshot echoing through the fog as the creature's head snapped back, and it fell still. A moment of silence fell over the street, broken only by the ragged breathing of the MTF operatives. Carter scanned the area, his senses still on high alert. But the creatures were gone, either dead or retreated back into the shadows. "Status," Reynolds called out, his voice tense. "All clear," Ruiz replied, his gaze sweeping the fog. "For now, at least." Carter lowered his rifle, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. They had survived another encounter with the sleep killers, but he knew this wasn't the end. SCP 966 was still out there, watching, waiting for the next opportunity to strike, and he could only hope that, when it did, they would be ready. The aftermath of the skirmish left the street eerily quiet, the fog reclaiming the town like a shroud of death. Agent Carter stood amidst the debris, his breath ragged, his body trembling with the adrenaline that had yet to fade. Around him, the rest of the team regrouped, their expressions a mixture of relief and grim resolve. "Good work, everyone," Captain Reynolds said, his voice low but carrying an edge of urgency. "But we're not out of the woods yet. These things are still out there, and they know we're a threat now." Carter's mind raced as he scanned the empty streets. The creatures had pulled back, but it wasn't a retreat, it was a tactical withdrawal. SCP-966 was intelligent, capable of strategy, and that made them even more dangerous. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the darkness itself was alive and plotting their demise. "Let's move," Reynolds ordered, motioning for the team to advance. "We need to secure the area and find any survivors, if there are any left." Carter followed the others, his rifle at the ready. They moved cautiously through the town, the buildings looming like silent sentinels. Every shadow seemed to twist and writhe, every gust of wind carrying the faintest whisper of something sinister. Carter's nerves were on edge, his senses tuned to a razor's edge. They reached a narrow alleyway, the kind that was perfect for an ambush. Carter's skin prickled with unease as they entered, the fog closing in around them like a living entity. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on him until he felt like he could hardly breathe. "Hold up," Ruiz said, raising a hand. "Do you hear that?" Carter strained his ears, trying to catch what Ruiz had noticed. There was a faint sound, almost imperceptible, the soft, rhythmic thumping of something moving nearby. His heart skipped a beat as he turned, his goggles sweeping the area for any sign of movement. There, just at the edge of his vision, he caught a glimpse of a figure. It was huddled in the corner of the alley, rocking back and forth with slow, deliberate motions. Carter's breath caught in his throat as he approached cautiously, his rifle trained on the figure. "Identify yourself," he called out, his voice echoing through the narrow space. The figure stopped moving, its head snapping up in a jerky, unnatural motion. Carter tensed, his finger hovering over the trigger. For a moment he thought it was one of the creatures, masquerading as something human. Then he saw the face. It was a man, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his skin pale and clammy. He was muttering to himself, his voice a hoarse whisper that sent shivers down Carter's spine. "They're here. They're here. They never leave. They never sleep." Carter felt a pang of pity as he lowered his weapon slightly. This was one of the town's residents, a survivor who had been driven to the brink of madness by SCP-966's influence. The man looked up at Carter with hollow eyes, eyes that had seen horrors beyond comprehension. "They watch," the man muttered, his gaze darting around the alley. "They watch and wait. You can't hide. They know when you're alone." "Captain," Carter called out, his voice shaky. "We've got a civilian here. He's not in good shape." Reynolds moved forward, his expression hardening as he took in the sight. "Get him out of here," he ordered. "We need to get him to safety, away from this place." Carter moved to help the man, but as he reached out, the man shrieked and scrambled back, his eyes wide with terror. "No, don't touch me. They'll see. They'll know." "Easy," Carter said softly, trying to calm him. "We're here to help you. We need to get you out of here." But the man wasn't listening. He was beyond reason, lost in his own nightmare. Carter's heart ached as he watched the man claw at the ground, his fingers bloody and raw. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Carter saw it. A flicker of movement in the fog, a shadow that was there 1 second and gone the next. His blood turned to ice as he raised his rifle, his eyes scanning the alley. "Contact," Ruiz shouted, his voice ringing out like a gunshot. The creatures were back, moving through the fog with a predatory grace. Carter fired, the bullets cutting through the air as they struck one of the shapes. It let out a screech, its form twisting and flickering in the infrared light. "They're trying to surround us," Reynolds yelled. "Fall back. Now." Carter grabbed the man by the arm, pulling him to his feet. The man screamed and struggled, his limbs flailing as Carter dragged him along. They moved quickly, the creatures closing in from all sides. The alley was a death trap, and Carter could feel the cold breath of SCP-966 on the back of his neck. They burst into the open street, the fog parting before them like a living thing. The creatures followed, their forms barely visible but their presence unmistakable. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he fired over his shoulder, trying to keep them at bay. The man was still screaming, his voice a high-pitched wail that grated on Carter's nerves. He looked back, his blood running cold as he saw the man's eyes wide with terror, staring at something behind them. No. Carter turned just in time to see one of the creatures lunge at him. He fired, the bullet ripping through its chest, but it didn't stop. Its claws raked across his arm, tearing through the fabric of his suit and into flesh. He cried out in pain, stumbling back as the creature reeled from the impact. Blood soaked his sleeve, hot and sticky against his skin. He fired again, the creature finally dissolving into the mist with a shriek. Carter, Ruiz shouted, pulling him back. Move, damn it. They ran, the fog closing in around them, the creatures at their heels. The man's screams echoed in Carter's ears, a constant reminder of the horror they were facing. He could feel the fear creeping in, the cold fingers of despair wrapping around his heart. They reached the next intersection, the lights of the base a faint glimmer in the distance. Carter's arm throbbed with pain, but he pushed on, his mind focused on one thing: survival. The creatures were relentless, their pursuit a silent, deadly dance through the darkness. Keep going, Reynolds ordered, his voice strained. We're almost there. Carter forced himself to move, his breath ragged and his vision blurring. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing in around them like a living thing. He could feel SCP-966, feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to fall. They burst through the door of the base, slamming it shut behind them. The creatures clawed at the walls, their screeches filling the air. Carter collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The man they had saved was huddled in the corner, rocking back and forth with a vacant stare. Carter's arm was a mess of blood and torn fabric, the pain a dull roar in the back of his mind. We can't stay here, Reynolds said, his voice harsh and urgent. We're sitting ducks. We need to move, find a safer location. Carter nodded, his eyes fixed on the door. The creatures were out there, hunting them, waiting for their next move. And in that moment he realized the true horror of SCP-966. It wasn't just about killing, it was about breaking them, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. They had survived, but for how much longer? In the cold, fog-filled night, Carter knew one thing for certain: the sleep killers weren't finished with them yet. And when they returned, it would be with a vengeance. The oppressive atmosphere inside the base was suffocating, a tangible reminder of the horror that lurked just beyond the walls. Agent Carter gritted his teeth against the searing pain in his arm, the wound from SCP-966's claws a constant reminder of their lethal presence. The civilian they had rescued sat huddled in a corner, muttering incoherently, his eyes darting around the room, as if seeing things that weren't there. We can't stay here, Captain Reynolds muttered, pacing back and forth. They'll tear through these walls eventually. We need to move and find a defensible location. But where? Ruiz asked, his gaze fixed on the map sprawled across the table. The whole town's a death trap. Carter forced himself to stand, pushing through the pain. What about the school on the north side? He suggested, his voice strained. It's got a basement, reinforced doors. We might be able to hold out there. Reynolds paused, considering the suggestion. It's a risk, he said finally, but it might be our best shot. We need to get this civilian to safety and regroup. Then let's move, Ruiz said, his voice hardening with determination. The longer we stay here, the more vulnerable we are. They gathered their gear quickly, knowing that every second counted. Outside, the creatures still prowled, their presence a dark stain on the very air they breathed. Carter adjusted his infrared goggles, steeling himself for what was to come. The school was several blocks away, a journey through hostile territory with no guarantee of safety. As they stepped out into the fog, the cold bit into Carter's skin, the night filled with an eerie stillness. The town was a ghostly maze, the buildings looming like silent sentinels. They moved as one, a tight-knit unit, with Reynolds and Ruiz flanking the civilian to keep him steady. Carter took point, his rifle at the ready. His senses were on high alert, every nerve in his body screaming danger. The fog seemed to shift and swirl around them, concealing whatever horrors lay within. He could feel SCP-966 watching, their eyes boring into his back, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They had made it halfway to the school when the first attack came. A faint whisper of movement, a shadow flitting across Carter's vision. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest as he scanned the area. Contact, he shouted, firing into the darkness, and the night erupted into chaos. The creatures surged from the fog, their forms flickering in and out of sight as they moved with inhuman speed. Carter fired, the bullets ripping through the air, but the creatures were too fast, too agile. They darted around him, their claws flashing in the dim light. "Get to the school," Reynolds ordered, his voice a beacon of authority amidst the frenzy. "Now." Carter fell back, firing as he moved. The creatures were relentless, their eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. He could feel the cold grip of terror tightening around his heart, but he pushed it down, focusing on the mission. The civilian screamed, a high-pitched wail that sent a jolt of fear through Carter. He turned just in time to see one of the creatures lunging at the man, its claws outstretched. Carter fired, the bullet striking the creature in the chest and sending it sprawling to the ground. "Keep moving," Ruiz shouted, dragging the civilian along as they sprinted towards the school. They were almost there, the building looming ahead like a beacon of hope in the darkness. But the creatures were closing in, their howls echoing through the fog as they pursued their prey. Carter's legs burned with exertion, every muscle screaming in protest, but he pushed on. The school's doors were just ahead, reinforced and heavy, a potential sanctuary against the nightmare that chased them. "Get inside now," Reynolds ordered, covering their retreat with a barrage of gunfire. Carter reached the doors, yanking them open as the others rushed inside. He slammed them shut, the metallic clang reverberating through the empty halls. The creatures screeched outside, their claws scraping against the metal as they tried to force their way in. "Seal it up," Reynolds barked, already working to barricade the entrance. They piled desks, chairs, anything they could find against the doors, creating a makeshift barrier. The creatures pounded against it, their rage palpable, but the doors held firm. For now. Carter slumped against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His arm throbbed with pain, but he forced himself to stay focused. They had made it inside, but this was far from over. "Basement," Ruiz said, his eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor. "It's the only place we can hold out." "Agreed," Reynolds replied, his voice grim. "Carter, you take point. Ruiz, you cover our rear. Move." They moved quickly, navigating the darkened halls of the school. Every shadow seemed to twist and contort, every sound amplified by the oppressive silence. Carter's mind was a whirlwind of fear and determination. They had survived the initial attack, but he knew the creatures wouldn't give up so easily. They reached the basement door, a heavy steel barrier that would provide some measure of protection. Carter pushed it open, scanning the stairs leading down into the gloom. The air was damp and cold, a stark contrast to the chaos above. "Go," Reynolds urged, and they descended into the darkness. The basement was a maze of storage rooms and maintenance corridors, the air thick with dust and neglect. They found a central room, reinforced with concrete walls and a single heavy door. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best they had. "We'll make our stand here," Reynolds said, his voice firm. "Seal the door, set up defenses. We hold this position until extraction." Carter and Ruiz worked quickly, reinforcing the door and setting up a perimeter with what little resources they had. The civilian sat in the corner, rocking back and forth with his eyes squeezed shut, his muttering a constant, maddening drone. As they finished their preparations, the sounds from above grew louder. The creatures were inside the school now, their movements a symphony of scraping claws and hissing breaths. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he raised his rifle, aiming it at the door. "They're coming," Ruiz said, his voice a low whisper. The first thud against the door sent a shiver down Carter's spine. The creatures pounded and scratched, their rage shaking the very foundations of the room. He could see the door bowing under the assault, the hinges groaning in protest. "Hold your fire," Reynolds ordered, his eyes fixed on the door. "Wait for them to breach." Carter's hands trembled on his rifle. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape this nightmare, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped, cornered like animals, and the predators were closing in. The door splintered, a crack forming at its center. Carter tightened his grip, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. This was it, their last stand. "Steady," Reynolds whispered, his eyes cold and steady. "Make every shot count." The door burst open, and the creatures flooded in, a tide of darkness and death. Carter fired, the room exploding into chaos as bullets flew and the creatures screeched in fury. They came at him from all sides, their claws slashing through the air, their eyes glowing with a sickening hunger. Carter moved on instinct, his training taking over as he aimed and fired, aimed and fired. The creatures were relentless, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in around him. He could feel their breath on his skin, the cold touch of death brushing against his soul. "Fall back," Ruiz shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "To the inner room." They retreated to the far corner of the basement, the creatures swarming over the debris in a frenzy of rage. Carter fired until his rifle clicked empty, the magazine spent. He grabbed his sidearm, firing into the writhing mass as they closed the door to the last room. The creatures pounded against it, their howls filling the air. Carter's heart raced as he and Ruiz pressed their weight against the door, holding it shut with every ounce of strength they had left. "Hold it," Reynolds ordered, his voice a lifeline in the chaos. They braced themselves, the door shaking violently as the creatures threw themselves against it. Carter gritted his teeth, his muscles burning with the effort. This was it. This was where they would make their stand, where they would either survive or die. The pounding grew louder, more frantic, but they held. Seconds stretched into an eternity, the room filled with the sounds of their struggle, their fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the assault stopped. Silence. Carter's breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion. He glanced at Reynolds, his eyes questioning, but the captain's face was as unreadable as ever. "They're toying with us," Reynolds said, his voice a low growl. "But we're not done yet." Carter nodded, his heart still racing. They had survived for now, but he knew this was just another game to SCP-966. The sleep killers were out there waiting for the next move, the next opportunity to strike. And when they did, Carter would be ready. They all would. The silence was heavy, oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation. Agent Carter stood in the dimly lit room, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall, his eyes fixed on the door that separated them from the horrors outside. The pounding had stopped, but he knew SCP 96 was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Captain Reynolds moved quietly around the room, checking their remaining ammunition and supplies. His face was a mask of calm determination, but Carter could see the tension in his eyes, the weight of command bearing down on him. They had reached the endgame, and everyone knew it. "Listen up," Reynolds said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've got one shot at this. We're going to lure them into the inner room and hit them with everything we've got. No holding back." Carter nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. His arm throbbed with pain, but he pushed it to the back of his mind. They had come too far to give up now. This was it, their last stand against the sleep killers. "We set up a trap," Ruiz added, his eyes cold and calculating. "Flashbangs and incendiaries. We draw them in, then light them up." Carter glanced around the room, noting the grim determination on every face. The civilian they had rescued sat huddled in the corner, his eyes wide with terror. There was no escape from this. They either fought and won, or they died trying. Reynolds gave the signal, and they moved quickly, setting up the trap in the center of the room. Flashbangs rigged to go off the moment the creatures breached the door, followed by a hail of incendiary rounds to finish the job. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. Carter took his position, his rifle aimed at the door. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching into an eternity as they waited. The fog outside seemed to press against the walls, a living entity that whispered of death and despair. Then they heard it, the soft, scraping sound of claws against concrete. Carter's breath caught in his throat as he tightened his grip on the rifle. The creatures were coming, drawn by the scent of fear, the promise of prey. "Hold your positions," Reynolds whispered, his eyes fixed on the door. "Wait for my signal." Carter's pulse quickened, his senses heightened to the point of pain. The sound grew louder, a chorus of scraping and hissing that echoed through the corridors. He could feel the cold presence of SCP 966, could feel their hunger, their desire to end this game once and for all. The door rattled, and Carter's finger hovered over the trigger. A low growl reverberated through the room, a sound that sent shivers down his spine. This was it, the final showdown. With a deafening crash, the door burst open, and the creatures poured in. They moved with unnatural speed, their forms a blur of darkness and rage. Carter fired, the flashbangs exploding in a blinding light that illuminated the room. The creatures shrieked, their movements frantic as they recoiled from the sudden assault. "Now," Reynolds shouted. Carter unleashed a barrage of gunfire, the incendiary rounds lighting up the room with a hellish glow. The creatures writhed and thrashed, their forms twisting in the firelight. He could hear their screams, a cacophony of pain and fury that drilled into his mind. One of the creatures lunged at him, its claws slicing through the air. Carter ducked, firing point blank into its chest. The bullet tore through it, but the creature kept coming, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. Carter kicked it back, grabbing his sidearm and firing into its skull. It screeched and fell, its body dissolving into a cloud of black smoke. He turned to find another creature closing in, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "Incoming," Ruiz shouted, tossing an incendiary grenade into the midst of the creatures. The grenade exploded, flames roaring through the room and engulfing the remaining creatures. They howled in agony, their bodies contorting as the fire consumed them. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, a sickening stench that made Carter's stomach churn. But they weren't done yet. The creatures were relentless, their rage driving them forward even as they burned. Carter fired again and again, his mind a blur of fear and adrenaline. He could see them, feel them all around him, the darkness pressing in, suffocating. "Hold the line," Reynolds commanded, his voice a lifeline in the chaos. Carter reloaded, his hands moving on autopilot as he aimed and fired. The creatures were everywhere, their claws slashing through the air, their eyes gleaming with a hunger that could never be sated. He could feel their breath on his skin, the cold touch of death brushing against his soul. He saw one of them go for the civilian, its jaws wide open in a silent scream. Without thinking, Carter threw himself in the creature's path, firing his last round into its head. The creature convulsed and fell, its body dissolving into ash as it hit the ground. And coming from the left, Ruiz yelled, his voice strained. Carter spun around, his eyes locking onto another creature charging at them. He grabbed an incendiary round from his belt, shoving it into his rifle and firing. The creature exploded into flames, its screeching wail echoing through the room. The onslaught seemed endless, a wave of darkness and death that threatened to overwhelm them. But they fought on, every shot, every explosion a defiant scream against the terror that surrounded them. Carter could feel his strength waning, could feel the cold fingers of exhaustion wrapping around him. "Fall back to the center," Reynolds ordered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. Carter moved, his legs heavy with fatigue. The creatures were closing in, their movements a blur of shadows and teeth. He fired, the bullets tearing through them, but it wasn't enough. They kept coming, kept pushing forward, their eyes burning with an unholy light. "Now," Reynolds shouted, his hand on the detonator. The room erupted into fire and light as the final trap went off. The blast wave knocked Carter off his feet, the heat searing his skin as he hit the ground. He lay there, dazed, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Slowly, the world came back into focus. The room was filled with smoke, the air thick with the stench of burning flesh. He could hear the crackle of flames, the distant howls of the creatures as they burned, but they were fading, their presence dissipating into the darkness. Carter pushed himself up, his body trembling with exhaustion. Around him, the room was a scene of carnage, the floor littered with the charred remains of SCP 966. The creatures were dead, their forms reduced to nothing but ash and smoke. "We did it," Ruiz said, his voice a mix of disbelief and relief. "We actually did it." Carter nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They had survived, had fought back against the nightmare and won. But as he looked around, at the destruction and the death, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a temporary victory. The sleep killers were gone, but the scars they had left would remain. And somewhere out there, in the dark corners of the world, other horrors waited. They had survived this night, but the fight was far from over. Captain Reynolds walked over, his face grim but his eyes burning with a fierce determination. "Good work, everyone," he said quietly. "We held our ground. We did what we came here to do." Carter nodded, his mind still reeling from the battle. They had won, but the cost had been high. He glanced at the civilian, who sat staring at the flames with hollow eyes. They had saved him, but at what price? As the flames died down and the room plunged into darkness once more, Carter felt a chill run down his spine. This was the world they lived in, a world of shadows and monsters, where every victory was bittersweet and every battle left its mark. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The fight was over, but the war was far from done, and in the back of his mind, he knew that somewhere, out there in the darkness, the sleep killers were watching, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of burning flesh and gunpowder. Carter stood amidst the smoldering ruins of their final stand, the adrenaline slowly draining from his veins, leaving him hollow and trembling. The charred remains of SCP 966 lay scattered across the floor, their forms twisted and unrecognizable. The horror of what they had just survived hung in the air, a suffocating reminder of the thin line between life and death. "Check for survivors," Captain Reynolds ordered, his voice rough from the smoke. "We need to secure this area and get a status report." Carter nodded, his body moving on autopilot as he scanned the room for any signs of movement. The civilian they had saved was still huddled in the corner, his eyes staring blankly ahead, rocking back and forth. Ruiz approached him cautiously, but the man didn't react, lost in a world of terror from which he might never return. "Hey, you all right?" Ruiz asked, his voice gentle despite the edge of exhaustion. The man didn't respond, his lips moving silently as if speaking to ghosts. Carter felt a pang of pity for him, knowing that even if they had saved his life, his mind was shattered, a casualty of the nightmarish ordeal they had endured. Carter turned his attention to the others, his heart sinking as he took in the scene. They had lost 2 more operatives in the final battle, their bodies lying amidst the debris, faces frozen in expressions of fear and determination. He knelt beside one of them, closing the man's eyes with a trembling hand. This was the cost of their victory, a victory that felt hollow in the face of such loss. "We did what we had to do," Reynolds said, his voice strained but resolute. "The mission was to contain SCP 966, and we did that. We survived." "At what cost?" Carter muttered, his voice barely audible. "Was it worth it?" Reynolds looked at him, his eyes hard but not unkind. "It's never easy, Carter. We do what we do to keep others safe, to make sure the things that go bump in the night don't get to them. Remember that." Carter nodded slowly, the weight of the captain's words sinking in. This was the reality of the world they lived in, a world where monsters were real, and the fight against them was never truly over. He had survived his first mission, but it had changed him, left a mark that would never fade. They moved quickly, securing the area and gathering what remained of their gear. The extraction team was on its way, but they still had to ensure the town was clear of any remaining threats. Carter took one last look around the room, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The sleep killers were gone, but the darkness they left behind was palpable, a reminder that the battle against the unknown was far from over. "Let's move," Reynolds ordered, leading the way out of the school and into the fog-covered streets. The town was eerily silent, the fog still clinging to the buildings like a death shroud. Carter kept his rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Every step felt like a journey through a nightmare, the memories of their battle still fresh in his mind. As they made their way to the extraction point, the air seemed to grow colder, the silence pressing in around them. Carter's senses were on high alert, every sound, every rustle of wind sending a jolt of fear through him. He could feel the eyes on him, the unseen presence of SCP 966 still haunting the town. "Stay sharp," Ruiz muttered, his voice a low growl. "We're not out of this yet." Carter nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. They moved in a tight formation, their eyes scanning the streets and alleyways. The fog swirled around them, concealing whatever horrors might still be lurking in the shadows. They reached the extraction point, a small clearing on the edge of town. The transport vehicle was waiting, its engine idling in the darkness. Carter let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding as they approached, the sight of the vehicle a beacon of hope in sightage, oppressive gloom. "Move out," Reynolds ordered, motioning for the team to board the vehicle. Carter climbed inside, his body aching with exhaustion. He leaned back against the cold metal, closing his eyes for a moment as the vehicle rumbled to life. They had made it. They had survived. But as the vehicle moved through the town, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He opened his eyes, peering out the window into the fog-covered streets. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow move, a flicker of movement just at the edge of his vision. His heart skipped a beat, a cold dread settling in his gut. Then it was gone, the fog closing in around the vehicle as they drove away. Carter let out a shaky breath, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the mind after everything they had been through. They drove in silence, the weight of their mission hanging heavy in the air. Carter glanced at the others, seeing the same haunted look in their eyes, the same scars that marked them all. They had fought and won, but they had paid a price. "We did it," Ruiz said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "We contained them." "Yeah," Carter replied, his voice hollow. "We did." But as he spoke the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The sleep killers were gone, but there were other things out there, other nightmares waiting in the dark corners of the world. And he knew, deep down, that they would be called upon again, to face those horrors, to fight and survive. As they drove into the night, leaving the town behind, Carter stared out into the darkness, his mind a whirlwind of fear and resolve. This was the life he had chosen, the path he had taken, and he knew it would never truly end. The war against the darkness was just beginning, and he was ready.